I do believe that these memorial won't simply have to convey information to its visitors. Its main purpose should be about providing visitors with reflection tools. So visitors should be able, after the visit, to maybe develop new standpoints and maybe develop a new approach to those things and topics. So trying to be better equipped, let's say, to tackle those topics. Again, the Villa Emma episode was extraordinary but also full of contradictions. And these contradictions should be enhanced and delved into. That is why we should keep on researching and studying. And of course, the memorial will be of great help to rekindle the interest also for this event. And so we should try to do something about that. So we should keep on searching and studying and then see how then the result of such research could be disseminated. And then when it comes to communicating, well, now I would like to give the floor to the speakers. And we can start with Nicholas Stargardt, professor at Oxford University, Magdalen College. He deals with the social history of Nazi Germany. And I think that the title of his lecture is very interesting. So, hiding and escaping Jewish young people during the Second World War. The floor is yours. Please speak into the mic. Thank you.
Per me è un grande onore.
I'm really honored to be here with you. My Italian is too poor.
From here on in. Fausto and Benedetta, when they invited me to come, asked if I would speak about children who were hidden during the Second World War. And this, of course, immediately produces what Maria Bacchi and Guido Pisi talked about as fragments and signs. We are left with small amounts of evidence, like in a broken mosaic, of something which once existed and which we have to reconstruct. The attempt of the Nazis to murder the Jewish population of Europe, of course, led to the death of 1.2 million children, perhaps. And if the attempt to destroy life had a unity of purpose, the attempt to save life leads you in many, many different directions. As we already heard this morning, it brings out a plurality of stories. It's not one story, it's many stories. And that's what I want to try to bring together. I didn't know when I planned this talk that we would be in a cinema, so it's actually very fitting that we're actually going to be looking at imagery. We're going to be looking at pictures, but also some secret film footage which was taken during the Second World War itself. I think one thing which becomes clear is that it's only in the last 20 years that historians have been able to find methods for talking and concepts for talking about this kind of history. Because on the one hand, we're talking about a history writing of social action, of social experience, but we're not talking about collective action like in the 1970s. We're talking about individual subjectivity, the fates and experiences of children whose identity changed by being hidden. They had to change their names, they had to change their religions often, they had to change their languages, and by the time, if they survived, that they could start to tell their stories, they were finding them in languages which they had often not spoken at the beginning of the experience. So this is a self-transformatory story as well as one where the outside world changes around them. Of course, at the beginning, they did not know this. So the story I want to start with begins in Belgium, and it's a Romanian boy who was 5 years old called Adrian Sapcaru, who was living in Ghent with his parents and his older brother, Claude. And in the autumn of 1942, he and a Jewish girl were taken in by a very wealthy Belgian family, De Bruyers. So the girl is actually the first one on the bicycle. She's called Monique Mogulewski. And Adrien, you will see in a moment, is in the donkey cart, and they're going to church. This is a very Catholic family in a little place called Saint-Denis-Westrem, outside Ghent. It's also a very wealthy family, and the first evening that the two Jewish children joined the other 7 De Breuer children for dinner in this very formal and, as you'll see, very large house, poor little Adrien was actually ill because he found it so overwhelming and so unlike the situation which he had come to before. But he quite soon fitted in with the other children, and as we'll see, found he wasn't allowed to leave the garden and the house very often, but there was quite a lot to do there. So this is a very important member of the family because he's, of course, called Adolf. There's a reason, of course, for calling a pig in Belgium during the Second World War Adolf, because this is one fate which you can control. And this is one Adolf who you knew would not actually survive the war. So this is little Adrien. As he settled into this world, this cocooned, safe world outside Ghent, of course, his own familial world changed. His parents were denounced by a neighbor in the street that they lived on, a teacher, and were arrested just after the older brother had been taken into hiding by somebody else. In 1945, the father came back exhausted from Auschwitz via Mauthausen and Buchenwald, and emaciated, and the mother did not return. For the next 5 years, the family remained in Ghent, but by this point, Adrien had become Adrien Simon, and no longer thought of himself as Adrien Sapcaru, and he also wanted to be Catholic and not Jewish. And although the De Bruyers were very, very considerate and determined that he should retain his Jewish heritage, and they kept telling him stories about his family, he wanted to be part of this new family and not actually to return to his old one. And I don't know whether some of you have perhaps read the wonderful memoir by the famous historian Saul Friedlander about being hidden as a child in a Catholic convent in France, where again he becomes genuinely Catholic and wants to actually become a Jesuit, until it's a Jesuit who tells him at the end of the war what really happened to his own parents after they were deported. And he then becomes Jewish again. And something similar happens to Adrien Simon. This is, of course, a search for safety and for a stable identity in a world which is unstable and unsafe. I want to now move, what you'll see is that we're moving contexts and the very different shaping of stories. Can we go to the next one? I think we have to go back. So it's there, and we need to get back to this. Yeah. Perfect. So this is taken from an official form from the psychiatric asylum in Hadamar, which is north of Frankfurt in Germany. And this was one of the centers for the murder of psychiatric patients during the Second World War. Over 10,000 people were either gassed there or later, after 1942, when the killing became more secretive, were starved and poisoned there. And by the time this was written in June 1943, it was by a half-Jewish boy. The Germans then were putting the different projects of killing Jews and killing psychiatric patients together, and they went through the social welfare institutions, the reformatories, the children's homes, and they found 42 Jewish children in Bavarian children's homes and elsewhere in Germany, and they sent them all to Hadamar. And one of the first things that they asked 14-year-old Alfred Völkel to do was to write out his life story. And he came from an ordinary Bavarian family, he thought. He did not know at this point that his father was Jewish because his mother was a single mother. He had never known his father. His mother was a Bavarian Catholic, so he thought he was just German. But he'd been put into children's homes by her because she married somebody else, had stepchildren. He wanted to become a clerical worker, but he ended up just with the training to be a bookbinder. By the point that he was able to smuggle a letter out of the psychiatric asylum to his uncle, who's a corporal in the German army on the Eastern Front, he's able to tell his uncle where he is and to ask him to get him out. By this point, he already knows that this is a place where every day is a gift of life, because each day he's being sent through the ward of the asylum where children are dying of causes which look like pneumonia. Their lungs are being flooded with water and fluid, and they're rasping for breath. And each day he's sent through this ward to another room to sort out the clothes of the children who have died. And he knows that if he's not summoned to the office or he's not sent to this ward, then he will survive for another day. After 4 months in the asylum, he is finally released because of a technicality of law. His uncle is able to prove that he is the legal guardian of the child and not the social welfare youth office in Nuremberg. And this technicality means that he can withdraw Alfred from the home. And he does something which Jewish children, or fully Jewish children, could only dream of, which is he goes home, he rejoins the Hitler Youth, and he ends up fighting in a German uniform in the Volkssturm in the last months of the war. He's captured by the Americans, and after the war, he emigrated to the United States. It took until 1996 before he visited Hadamar again, so nearly 53 years later. And it was only when he read his file in the office in which patients were selected for different causes of death before they were killed, sitting in this same office, that he read his file and he realized why he had been sent there in the first place. It was the first time he realized that his own father was Jewish. And so this is this complicated story of shame within a Catholic family where they denied this Jewish heritage from the child, but at the same time they rejected him. And this was his own comment on it. He wrote a second biography, this time for the archivists, where he explained that to him Nazi persecution was something very intimate. It was about being rejected by his own mother, who clearly preferred a stepfather and later 2 stepchildren or step-siblings to him. The third case I want to bring you to is the drawings of a Polish Jewish girl called Nelly Landau, who survived against the odds in the ghetto of Lwów. So this is eastern Poland, what's now Lviv in the Ukraine, and always had a mixed population of Ukrainians, Jews, and Poles. In the spring of 1943, so a couple of months before Völkel went to Hadamar, she was able to escape from the ghetto for the 3rd time. The first 2 attempts had failed because her identity, her cover story, her attempt to learn catechism and recite Catholic prayers correctly failed. And this time, they didn't try to live publicly. They found a house which was in the German part of Lvov, so it was a prosperous area surrounded by German occupation personnel. And she and her mother hid in a little room in an apartment which was held by former tenants of the family. So the father had owned this apartment, and these were the Polish lodgers, the Wojteks, Michał and Krysia. The woman is very caring to them, and the asset of this apartment is that it has a bricked up window. There is an alcove behind the window where they can hide behind a tapestry if anybody comes in. So it's a very insecure hiding place, or as they would have said at the time, a malin. And her principal problem is not fear, but boredom. She can't leave this place. And so what she does is she starts to draw the stories, the fairy stories, which her mother tells her to keep her occupied. So her mother gives her educational classes and also tells her Greek myths and Russian fairy stories. So I assume this is a Russian fairy story that she's drawing. She also, is the next one? She also draws what she can see out of the window. She's never allowed to go right up to the window in case people see the silhouette from the street, but she does draw rather enviously the other girls going off to school with their teacher. And can we have the next? And she creates dramas. So she does a whole series which revolve around the way her mother prevents herself being bored, which is to keep knitting. So her mother knits woolen jumpers and woolen things. So there's this image of what she calls Eva's knitting shop. And this illustrates one of the few moments of actual danger, which is people unexpectedly came to visit the Wojteks, and as they ran into the secret room, her mother left the ball of wool underneath the door with the thread on her side of the door, and she tried to pull it. And of course, the people immediately said, "Who are you hiding in there? Who is it who's there?" So they broke the thread, and the wool could be picked up from the other side without anybody seeing that there really was somebody there. But this is then the reason for this long ball of wool in the middle of this picture. The principle, what's interesting about these paintings is, of course, it's difficult to get paints if you're in hiding. And so people always, even in a stable situation like this, they always need assistance. And in this case, the assistance and the paints come from the communist neighbor of the Wojteks, who's the only other person, a woman called Olga, who's the only other person in the house who knows that there are these two Jews hiding there. And I think it's important as we talk about the peculiarity and the special character of Nonantola that everybody knew about this, that in most of these Polish contexts, whom you trust and whom you do not trust, who you tell, who you do not tell, is very complicated. And some of the same stories of people who help also are people who might blackmail. And the stories of helping and not helping become very crossed. They become very complicated. But I want to remind you that one of the first things, of course, that happens when the war and the occupation came to Eastern Europe and later to Southern Europe with the Germans is that the safe walls of childhood are destroyed and the children become social actors. They're not just passive objects of assistance, as you might see here. Can we go on? But here in the middle of Warsaw, we have a group of Polish Jewish children who have survived the destruction of the ghetto, and this is 6 months later, in the autumn of 1943, and it's 10 months before the Polish uprising in Warsaw. So during this period of 16 months, from the spring of 1943 to the summer of 1944, they are living openly on the street, but not as Jews, of course, but as Poles. And they're met, or two of them are met. This is the leader of the group, who's known as the English slang is bull, so I suppose toro would be. And he has this friend who has this very Jewish nose called Naso. And the two of them are the leaders of this group. Bull had already jumped from a train which was meant to take him from Warsaw to Treblinka. So like a number of other people who jumped from trains, he had nowhere in the countryside to hide. So he still has to come back to the city, however dangerous that might be. And in the autumn of 1943, they are helped. They are spotted by a member of the Jewish socialist underground group, Zegota, who spots them in a canteen and starts to talk to them. And they realize very quickly what the cover story is of each of them. But because he has links to the socialist underground, which is one of the few Polish non-Jewish and Polish-Jewish joint organizations, he's able to get false papers for them from the underground. And this becomes a critical factor in their survival, and they create a web in which a number of, can we have the next one? A number of these boys are smuggling German uniforms for the Polish resistance, Romek and Stasek, and selling, above all, they're selling cigarettes. So they stand on Three Crosses Square, which is in the middle of German Warsaw, with every restaurant saying Eintritt nur für Deutsche, entry only for Germans, and they're competing with Polish cigarette sellers for this space on the street. And they're so successful at it that they actually have enough money to have themselves photographed. I mean, that's the really interesting thing about these photographs, is that they were taken at the time. They have a certain amount of power. And one of the things that these two boys, Romek and Stasek, managed to do is to turn up wearing actually German Organisation Tod uniforms, where they can really impress the Polish kids because they have the power of the uniform. They, of course, benefit when the uprising takes place in the city, because not only is there enormous chaos, but the leader of the group joins the uprising and in fact fights his way across the river to the Praga district at the end of the uprising so that he's able to join the liberated side of Warsaw. Others are not so lucky, and in the aftermath of the uprising, as the entire population is deported out of the city and Himmler is given the task of destroying Warsaw completely, they're shipped to labor camps in Germany. And in this atmosphere of defeat, so there's also a rediscovery of anti-Semitism amongst the Polish civilian inmates of these camps. And the girls, can we have the next one? Like Stefcia here, have to actually be protected by Belgian workers in the camp. Otherwise, there was a very great risk that they would have been denounced to the Germans. So these stories of survival take place right across Europe and in very different circumstances, which one can only really understand through the classic methodology of microhistory, of the microcosmos, in which these children are, and young adolescents are learning to act. And learning to act and learning to survive are not things which end with liberation. It's only the end of one part of this story. What survival would actually mean is not at all clear. And in the former camps, labor camps and concentration camps of Germany, after May 1945, they become displaced person camps. I was interested to hear this word again last night. And the Jewish survivors move quite quickly towards those in the south because the Americans established separate camps for Jews. And what's interesting about these, did we miss something?
Maybe.
No. Okay. It's a different slideshow from the one I thought there was. Yes, can we move to this? These are very interesting because a number of the children from these camps about 300 of them, mainly from Buchenwald. So many of the people who end up in Buchenwald are on the death marches or evacuation marches from Auschwitz. And they end up either in Buchenwald or in Mauthausen. And in Buchenwald, there are a number of children who are brought in the summer of 1945 to Switzerland for physical and also psychological rehabilitation. And the social workers who work with them encourage them to draw as a form of therapy and as a form of play therapy. And they also watch the games that the children play. So one of the games is they play at the things that they had seen in the camps. They play at Aktion, they play at roll call, they play the entire life of the camp. And this is a cycle of 12 drawings, no, stay with this, by a 16-year-old Polish-Jewish boy called Kalman Landau, who essentially creates a chronology of his war. So it starts with the arrival from home in the camp. And of course, what you see is that he's not drawing like a 16-year-old boy, he's drawing like an 8-year-old boy. He's drawing like somebody much younger, because the last time he drew, he was much younger. This is the interrupted development of somebody who is now being given crayons and pencils for the first time and trying to describe something also for the first time. And what you see, of course, is that the SS in their green uniforms are much, much bigger than any of the children or even the adults. This is true when they arrive. It's true when they have roll call in the camp. The prisoner functionaries, who are drawn rather beautifully, this is in all of their uniforms, thank you, Benedetta, are of course much more important and much bigger and have individual features, unlike the adult prisoners in the camp. And then we have this one where they're going to work in their metal factory, and it looks like a group of school children being taken on an outing by a teacher, except, of course, when you look at who the teachers are. It's only at the very end, when Buchenwald, yes, so this is, we are organizing. This is, of course, organizing is to steal things in a camp, is how you survive. Can we move on? So we again have another roll call till late at night, which is, of course, fatal for the prisoners. Then we have the public executions. Then we have the death marches out of Auschwitz. We have an attempt to do something which Kalman Landau had obviously never seen, which is to depict the gas chamber of Birkenau. He was, I think, almost certainly in Auschwitz I and never saw Birkenau and didn't realize that the crematorium was actually, had its entrance underground, not above ground. Can we move on? And then we have the rest of the evacuation march to Buchenwald, the prisoners being stacked like pieces of timber in these triple bunk beds of the quarantine camp. And finally, that crucial moment when the American tanks are coming towards the gate of Buchenwald, when the communist underground finally leads its uprising in the camp, which is a very famous moment. And even here, the guards are still not smaller than the prisoners, even though the prisoners are now the ones with power and therefore bigger than they were before. We still see the barbed wire, we still see these very large guards. And the final image is the arrival at the Rhine Falls near Schaffhausen, which is his point of liberation up to the present when he drew this. So it's a cycle of drawings which charts the progress in which he's not visible, but it tells his story as an external story. And the first social workers who came from Britain to work in Bavarian camps with Jewish children found that they told their stories dispassionately, as if they had happened to somebody else. There was no emotion. There was no, what you might call, interiority. There was no moment of subjective expression in what they had to say. And I think that's a very important element of this psychological rite of passage, that the first and most important thing for them It may have been trauma, but I think one could also see it the other way around, that this is a moment in which they need to tell a story which nobody else from the outside world has seen. So the first and most important thing for them is actually the fact of it, the facticity of the event, and not what they had experienced. I think we now live in an age where we want to know what the emotional experience was, but we have to first accept that for that generation, for them, the event was the critical thing. Can we move on? Oh, that's it. I've obviously cut it shorter. I thought I had several more pictures for you. But what I want to bring out, yes, I'm almost there. What I want to bring out is that these stories of self-discovery by telling others one's own story actually start immediately after the war. So if you think of Primo Levi's famous memoir, he wrote it immediately after he came back to Torino. And the idea that the survivor could only talk generations later, I think is actually tells you much about the societies in which they move. That the societies themselves are not ready to hear these stories after the late 1940s. There is a period, these drawings of Command Landau's were published in a Swiss magazine in 1946. But by 1947, 1948, people were already tired of so much horror. They didn't want to be told these things. There are many examples, including from Britain, of survivors who came, and the first thing they were told by their own relatives is, don't start telling us stories about the camps. We don't want to know what degenerate and depraved behavior you learnt there. And so for that first generation, the moral stigma did not actually end with liberation. The idea that to have suffered was in some ways heroic or a martyrology is something which was said in general, but not specifically to many of the survivors at the time. At the time, this was often something which had to be concealed, and people had to remake lives. And even some of the boys who survived Auschwitz, whom I traced to Israel, then described how when they first came to Palestine, they could not talk to anybody except each other about what they had experienced, because people would say, they would make bad jokes about soap, and they would actually call them soap. And this was not the heroic image that the new Israeli state and its armed forces wanted to create for itself. This was not a Zionist myth, not until the 1980s and 1990s. And we have to think quite hard about the stages at which people tell their stories, because I think they tell them very differently at different times. And that's the main reason as I said, I didn't know this was a cinema, but this was the main reason for trying to find drawings and photographs from either the time itself or immediately afterwards, so that you would see how this might be experienced and as a set of events at the time. Thank you.